Anne of Cleves, King Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell. These three names are connected to one of the most reckless political gambits in English history. But tonight, we won't talk about wars or treaties. We are going to listen to the story of Anne of Cleves, the woman who was publicly and bitterly rejected by King Henry VIII himself, the notoriously cruel and volatile giant. Yet, the extraordinary happened. After a mere 6 months as his wife, Anne not only survived but lived comfortably and wealthily for 17 more years, while the man who had cast her aside suffered from physical pain and crippling paranoia. She discovered the secret that none of Henry's other wives understood: how to escape Henry VIII, not just with your life, but with your freedom and your dignity. Was she truly the ugly wife who was discarded? Or was she a diplomatic master who executed a perfect losing move in exchange for everything? Hey guys! Tonight we will delve into the truth behind Henry's excuses and uncover the masterful survival strategy of a young German woman who turned her marriage failure into a personal victory that spanned nearly 2 decades. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always love knowing who is listening, so please take a moment to comment and let me know where you are and what your current local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the year 1540, beneath the soft, gilded glow that drifted through the great halls of Hampton Court, a quiet horror was beginning to take shape. It was not a tale of treason, nor a whisper of forbidden love, but something far heavier and far more intimate: the slow crushing of a woman's dignity simply because she could not awaken desire in her king. Anne of Cleves, a German princess sent across the cold winter sea, entered England as a symbol, a carefully chosen thread meant to strengthen the fragile tapestry of Protestant alliances. She was diplomacy in human form, a living promise meant to fortify Henry VIII in his uneasy struggle against the Catholic powers that surrounded him. And yet, almost the moment she arrived, her very existence began to curdle in the eyes of the Tudor court. This is not the softened legend of the lucky wife who escaped with her life. It is the unvarnished reality of a humiliation crafted with intention of a king whose decaying body and agitated mind poured their bitterness onto an innocent woman. By this time, Henry VIII had grown into something unrecognizable compared with the radiant prince he had once been. His massive frame depended on metal braces and leather supports just to move from chamber to chamber. His legs, plagued by ulcerations that seeped blood and pus, were wrapped in silk that hid nothing of the odor rising from his flesh. Those who served him learned to breathe through their mouths and to keep a respectable distance, not merely out of etiquette, but out of survival. Physicians who study the records now suggest osteomyelitis, an infection of the bone that brings unrelenting pain and foul discharge. In Henry's time, there was no understanding of bacteria, no real remedy beyond wrappings and opium, and the opium clouded his thoughts as surely as the pain tormented him. The combination made him unpredictable, volatile, and deeply dangerous. The infection likely disturbed his circulation and hormonal equilibrium, leaving physical intimacy not only difficult, but agonizing. Yet Henry's pride, immense and brittle, could not allow the simplest truth that his body was failing him. Instead, he twisted that truth outward. Rather than admit his own decline, he placed the weight of his impotence upon women, reshaping his shortcomings into accusations of feminine inadequacy. What he could not command from his own flesh, he blamed upon theirs. Thus the trap was already set for Anne of Cleves long before she ever laid eyes on the English shore. Her tragedy began quietly, thousands of miles away, in the stillness of her homeland, when Hans Holbein painted her portrait. The court artist, renowned for his realism, presented her with calm features and conventional German attire, her face serene beneath an ornate headdress. To flatter the king, courtiers spun tales that embroidered the portrait with impossible charm: skin like pale ivory, eyes bright with intelligence, a grace that would melt the heart of any man. Henry studied the portrait tirelessly, his imagination inflamed by vanity and longing. He fell in love, not with Anne, but with the painted illusion of her, an image no living woman could have embodied. And so, when she finally journeyed toward him, bearing the hopes of princes and preachers alike, she was already condemned. She was walking into a dream she had never agreed to inhabit, a fantasy she could never fulfill. The king's disappointment, when it came, would not be mild. It would become the seed of bitterness that shaped every step of her brief and sorrowed queenship. From the very first breath of her story, the foundations of a tragedy were already laid. A monarch rotting from the inside out, a court trained to echo his whims, and a woman born into the wrong moment, trapped in the wrong narrative, expected to embody a perfection that had never belonged to her. It was the beginning of a tale in which dignity would be tested, hope would wither, and the quiet endurance of a gentle soul would stand in stark contrast to the corruption that consumed the man she was forced to call her husband. Before she ever set foot in England, Anne, at that time 24 years old, had been shaped within the strict ceremonial order of the German court, a world where discipline softened into elegance and obedience blended with polished grace. She was trained in music, in etiquette, in the steady virtues expected of a noble consort, and she learned early that affection was rarely the foundation of royal marriages. She understood, with a quiet maturity, that women in European diplomacy were not simply daughters or sisters, but instruments of alliance, offerings made in exchange for stability, peace, or influence. In this delicate political fabric, she was the thread meant to bind England to the Lutheran states of Germany, a gentle but essential remedy for the isolation Henry VIII had created when he severed England from the authority of the Pope. Yet behind the confident signatures on letters and the elaborate negotiations between envoys, there was a nervous tremor running through the English court. Henry, once vibrant and admired, now struggled beneath the weight of declining health. His body pained him, his strength diminished, and his pride, that vast, towering pride, feared its own fading. He longed to be told he was still desirable, still powerful, still the magnificent figure he imagined himself to be. Courtiers, sensing the shifting moods of their sovereign, embroidered praises around Anne's portrait, not out of loyalty to her, but out of fear of displeasing him. With every embellished compliment, they shaped an expectation no human woman could fulfill, and with each exaggeration, they unknowingly planted the seeds for the catastrophe to come. The misfortune began with the portrait painted by Hans Holbein. Although Holbein was celebrated for his realism, the courtiers who presented the portrait to Henry described Anne as gentler, softer, and more refined than even the painting suggested. They spoke of subtle radiance, of quiet charm, of a grace nearly ethereal. Henry studied the portrait obsessively, letting the stillness of paint and parchment become the foundation of a fantasy. In that image, he found what he wished to see, not what was truly there. He built, stroke by imagined stroke, a vision of idealized womanhood, one that would impose a cruel burden upon the living woman who bore her name. When Anne travelled to England near the end of the year 1539, she carried with her the diplomatic hopes of two nations. She prepared herself with diligence and sincerity, practicing the English language, learning the steps of local dances, selecting garments that would honour her new homeland, and steadying her mind for the role that awaited her. She did not come as a girl, but as someone ready to uphold duty with the composure her upbringing had taught her. All she needed, she believed, was to behave with propriety, kindness, and respect. But every lesson she had mastered dissolved in an instant when Henry chose to greet her not as a king, but as a performer in what he imagined was a romantic masquerade. Disguised as a common messenger, he entered her chambers, hoping to ignite a spark powerful enough to confirm the fantasies he had woven from Holbein's portrait. He wished for astonishment, for a gasp of recognition, for the trembling awe of love at first sight, a reaction he felt he deserved, and perhaps one he desperately needed. What happened instead was simple courtesy. Anne, raised within the rigid boundaries of German etiquette, did not recognize the coarse stranger before her. She greeted him calmly, with the same polite composure she would offer any unknown visitor. There was no swoon, no breathless admiration, no sign that she sensed greatness standing before her because she did not. And that was enough to wound the fragile pride of a king who could no longer command admiration merely by entering a room. From this single moment, the quiet axis of her life shifted. Henry's disappointment hardened into resentment, and resentment quickly grew into a threat not to her actions, but to his own deteriorating sense of himself. In her calmness, he saw failure. In her composure, insult. In her inability to play the part he imagined, a challenge to the myth he still clung to. And so, from that brief encounter forward, Anne became not a bride, not an ally, but a mirror reflecting truths the king could not bear to face. She became a danger to the vanity that ruled him far more than any council or crown ever could. After the disastrous first meeting, Henry moved toward the wedding not with hope, but with the heavy certainty of a man already searching for an escape. Yet political necessity pressed upon him. And so, on the 6th day of January in the year 1540, the ceremony unfolded with all the glitter and solemnity of a royal union. The abbey shimmered with gold, with brocade, with the polished surfaces of jewels and candlelight. But beneath the grandeur lay an unmistakable chill. Henry, wrapped in cloth of gold that caught every flicker of the flame, wore a face lined not with joy, but with disgust, as though each step toward the altar deepened some private dread. Anne, steadying her breath, moved with quiet dignity through a forest of watching eyes, each gaze measuring her, judging her, waiting for her to falter. In that sacred space, she felt less like a bride and more like an offering placed upon a throne that had no room for her. When night arrived, the promise of union collapsed into something closer to a whispered legend of horror. Henry approached the marriage bed with the gait of a man half consumed by decay, his breath thick with the scent of infection, his ulcerated legs wrapped in layers of linen that could not conceal their seepage. The room, meant to mark the beginning of intimacy, instead became a stage where humiliation settled like fog. Lying beside her, he blamed her for the revulsion that rose from his own body, for the weakness he could not confront, for the impotence he could not bear to claim. In the dim light, he planted the first seeds of a story he would later repeat, that she smelled unpleasant, that she lacked beauty, that she was somehow physically flawed. These whispers were not born of truth but of terror, the terror of a king who could not admit that his decline had touched even the most sacred corner of his pride. It did not take long for the court to notice the shift in Henry's mood. Rumours moved through the corridors with the soft quickness of mice, gathering strength as they passed from mouth to mouth. Courtiers murmured that Anne was stiff, foreign, unappealing. They mimicked her German accent with cruel exaggeration, turning her heritage into a joke meant to amuse those who stood closest to power. Soon the vicious nickname, the Flanders Mare, clung to her like a shadow she could not outrun, repeated by those who hoped their cruelty might win them a moment of the king's approval. Each repetition chipped away at her dignity, reducing a woman of noble birth to a caricature whispered behind fans and goblets. But these insults were not merely thoughtless cruelty. They served a single purpose: to protect Henry's fragile image. If Anne could be made to seem defective, then Henry, aging, infected, increasingly unable to perform the duties of a husband, could be framed as an unfortunate victim rather than a failing man. Thus the lie grew, fed by the fears of those who depended upon his favour and feared his wrath. Matters worsened when the king's physicians entered the picture. Ordered to examine Anne in search of evidence, they conducted intrusive and humiliating inspections under the guise of medical necessity. These examinations, documented with false authority, served only to bolster the narrative Henry wished to present, that the marriage remained unconsummated not because of his own suffering body, but because Anne herself was unworthy of desire. The physicians, terrified of contradicting the sovereign, recorded their findings with the precision of men trapped between conscience and survival. Within mere weeks, Anne's reality transformed. She had crossed the sea as a princess of Cleves, trained in diplomacy, prepared for duty, hopeful that her role would bring stability to two realms. Yet she now found herself reduced to a symbol of ridicule, the convenient scapegoat for a king struggling beneath the weight of his own decline. The court, once eager to welcome her, now recoiled as though she carried some invisible stain. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, seemed destined to be twisted into further proof of her supposed inadequacy. Thus, in a matter of days, a woman who had done nothing wrong became trapped in a web of power, rumour, and royal insecurity. In that world, truth mattered less than the king's wounded pride, and the honour of a foreign princess could be torn apart by nothing more than whispers drifting through gilded corridors. Anne had entered England as a diplomatic bridge, but she stood now as a sacrificial offering, caught in the slow tightening of a system built to protect the powerful by destroying the powerless. The humiliation Anne endured did not come from Henry alone. The entire court filled with opportunists who adjusted their loyalties as swiftly as weather vanes turned against her almost overnight. Those who had once praised her now amused themselves by mimicking her voice, calling her dull, too German, unsuitable for English tastes. A small habit, a mispronounced word, a gesture shaped by her upbringing, each was seized upon as proof that she was unworthy to be queen. The palace, with all its glittering ceilings and polished floors, became a hall of distorted mirrors, reflecting back only the cruelest interpretations of her presence. Even the women of the household, Those who might have been expected to offer sympathy or companionship joined the assault. Instead of sisters in service, they became eyes and ears for the king, reporting everything she did, from the way she lifted her cup to the tone of her morning greetings. Their whispers were wrapped in deference when they reached Henry, but beneath the surface they were sharpened knives, crafted to draw favour at Anne's expense. In a world where survival depended on pleasing the monarch, kindness had no currency, and loyalty shifted toward whichever direction his mood leaned. Soon the mockery seeped beyond the palace walls. Pamphlets circulated among the people, suggesting that German women were fundamentally mismatched with English men, that the failure of the union was rooted not in the king's frailty but in foreign blood. These leaflets, written with feigned scholarly authority, portrayed the cultural difference as a flaw inherent in Anne herself. The propaganda served two purposes. It shielded Henry from criticism, and it prepared the public to accept the annulment that everyone sensed was approaching. Hatred, when properly disguised, could be sold as patriotism, and prejudice could be passed off as wisdom. Not content with mere rumour, the royal physicians added their voices to the chorus of deception. They produced elaborate, fabricated reports claiming that German temperament, German diet, and even German bodily humours had corrupted the king's masculine vigour. Though ludicrous, the statements catered perfectly to the paranoia gathering around Henry's declining health. Fear made him easy to manipulate, and those who wanted to protect their own positions fed him explanations that relieved him of blame. Each new lie draped another veil over the truth, until the court existed in a fog of carefully crafted fiction. Meanwhile, Henry drifted further into a fixation that would soon reshape the entire court. Catherine Howard, young, delicate, and brimming with the vitality he craved, she appeared like a sudden shimmer of sunlight across a dying landscape. She was everything Anne was, not English, youthful, pliant, trained to charm, and the contrast deepened the king's resentment toward his German queen. For Anne, the presence of this new and glittering rival felt like the ground crumbling beneath her feet. Whether at banquets, festivities, or formal ceremonies, she had to stand beside Catherine, maintaining a strained smile while watching the king's eyes follow the young girl with intoxicated delight. The torment was relentless. Each celebration became a stage where Anne was forced to play the supporting role in her own undoing. Her composure, once a sign of strength, now became the mask she needed to survive. She knew intimately the stories of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn women who had resisted, who had argued, who had demanded justice, and who had paid for their courage with their lives. One had died abandoned, the other beheaded. The memory of their fates lingered like a bitter perfume in the corridors, reminding her of what might await if she dared to show even a flicker of defiance. No one but Anne fully understood the danger that coiled around her. She had walked into a nest of serpents, and each day the snakes slithered closer. In this world, nothing escaped scrutiny. A sigh could be interpreted as arrogance, a lowered gaze as mutiny, a single misstep as treason. Each breath she took was measured, each movement weighed, each silence held with care. She lived within the tightening ribs of a court that fed on fear and rumour, her dignity shrinking beneath the venom of those who circled her, waiting for the king's next command. Anne existed, in those weeks, not as a queen, but as a creature, watched from all sides, a woman surviving among predators, hoping that stillness alone might keep her alive. Across Europe, the cruelty inflicted upon Anne echoed far beyond the walls of the English court. Observers in foreign capitals viewed her treatment not as a private marital failure, but as a public display of Tudor brutality. In the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, Henry's behaviour became the subject of sneering ridicule, a sign that the once magnificent king had descended into barbarism. In France, nobles mocked his inability to fulfill his duties, turning his declining virility into entertainment. And among the German states, the insult dealt to Anne was interpreted as a wound to the entire Lutheran cause. Her brother, Duke Wilhelm, contemplated severing the alliance altogether, weighing whether England was still a partner worth trusting after such a disgrace. The tension grew so sharp that only Anne's own finely crafted letters prevented a spiraling crisis. With the steady hand of someone trained in diplomacy since childhood, she wrote to reassure Wilhelm, to soothe tempers, and to ensure that the insult she had endured would not ignite a broader conflict. Her restraint, her measured tone, and her refusal to lash out preserved a fragile peace. Without her gentle intervention, the rift between England and the German principalities might well have erupted into a religious dispute with dangerous consequences. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the marriage, watched the political landscape shift beneath him. Once the king's most trusted minister, he now carried the full burden of Henry's disappointment. The marriage he arranged, once celebrated as a masterstroke of Protestant diplomacy, had become a symbol of humiliation in the king's eyes. Henry needed someone to blame, and Cromwell, after years of rising power, became the most convenient scapegoat. The irony was stark. The very union that had elevated him was now dragging him toward ruin. His new assignment, handed down with cold detachment, was to dismantle the marriage he had so carefully forged. It was a task he could not refuse, and one that would lead him directly to the executioner's block. The annulment unfolded like a performance rehearsed long before its actors stepped onto the stage. Lawyers combed through canon law, discovering precedents that miraculously aligned with the king's wishes. Clergymen drafted treatises, arguing that the union lacked proper consummation, that spiritual and physical incompatibilities made the marriage invalid. Witnesses were summoned not to speak truth, but to confirm what Henry needed them to affirm. Each statement, each document, each carefully constructed argument was designed to protect the king and erase any hint of his own failings. But the deepest cruelty of all lay in the impossible role assigned to Anne herself. When she cooperated, they labelled her simple-minded, claiming she lacked the sophistication to understand her own situation. When she held her silence, they called her cold, accusing her of emotional emptiness. Whether she bowed her head or kept her dignity upright, the judgment remained the same. She was at fault. In this carefully orchestrated narrative, the king's impotence became her deficiency, and her obedience became another mark against her. Yet history often forgets the quiet strength she carried in those suffocating days. Beneath her calm exterior, Anne built a subtle, resilient network of allies, merchants who admired her integrity, scholars who sympathized with her faith, and nobles unsettled by Henry's volatility found in her a figure worth supporting. They offered friendship, counsel, financial aid, and, more importantly, information. Through whispered conversations, discreet correspondence, and silent acts of loyalty, she created a web of protection that stretched across court and city alike. This network did not challenge the crown, nor did it proclaim rebellion. Instead, it served one purpose: to keep her alive in a realm where queens could vanish as swiftly as breath on glass. Anne understood better than anyone that survival in Tudor England required softness on the surface and steel beneath it. And while Henry's anger grew louder, her quiet resilience deepened the steady, unshaken center of a storm she had never chosen to enter. When Henry finally resolved to end the marriage, the terms presented to Anne appeared, at first glance, strangely generous. She was to keep the honorary title of the king's sister, receive large estates, enjoy a steady income, and retain a place of ceremonial respect at court, provided she never questioned the legality of the annulment. In exchange, she was required to declare publicly that the marriage had never been consummated, that she remained untouched, and that Henry acted solely from religious and legal necessity rather than from personal whim. The signing of the annulment documents was staged with theatrical splendor, but beneath the polished surface lay a quiet cruelty. Dressed in fine garments, surrounded by ambassadors and dignitaries, Anne was compelled to speak words that diminished her, statements claiming she was unworthy, that she recognized the king's mercy, that she accepted the judgment as just. These written confessions, crafted to humiliate her while shielding Henry, would serve for centuries as official proof of the king's fabricated narrative. On the same day the union was dissolved, Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Cleves alliance, was led to Tower Hill and executed. His rise had been breathtaking, his power once immense, but he now stood as yet another casualty of the king's shifting moods. The very arrangement he had engineered to secure England's future had become the reason for his downfall. As the blade fell and his life ended, Anne sat calmly at Richmond, eating her meal. She had learned the essential lesson of Tudor survival. Prominence invited danger, and those who stood too close to Henry's ambitions could be destroyed in an instant. Power in this kingdom was not merely unstable, it was lethal. She understood, with a clarity born from harsh experience, that resistance would not save her. Defiance had doomed queens before her. Catherine of Aragon, who fought for her marriage, died abandoned. Anne Boleyn, who asserted her place with brilliance and boldness, was beheaded. The crown was not a shield. In this treacherous world, survival demanded silence, adaptability, and a willingness to let pride fall away. And so she chose another path. to disappear just enough to remain untouched, to bow her head at the precise angle that protected her neck, to craft a life from the shadows rather than from the throne. Her acceptance was not weakness, it was strategy, a way to step aside before the storm closed in. She allowed the world to believe she had lost, knowing that in yielding, she preserved what mattered most, her safety. The Tudors were unpredictable, their tempers mercurial, their justice swift and unforgiving. In such a realm, to live quietly was its own form of victory. Anne saw clearly the truth that so many around her refused to acknowledge. Honor in this court could vanish before sunrise, reputation could shatter with a whisper, and a single displeasing gesture might place one beneath the sword. While others fought for influence, she studied the art of retreat, of gentleness, of invisibility, not out of fear alone, but out of understanding. A woman who could not be noticed could not be targeted, and a woman who did not compete could not be accused of treason. By slipping beneath the king's gaze, she stepped out of danger's reach. She surrendered the crown but kept her life, a choice that seemed small in the eyes of the world, but would prove wiser than anyone could have imagined. In the grand, glittering machinery of Tudor politics, where pride devoured men and power consumed women, Anne preserved herself by refusing to play the part of a tragic heroine. Instead, she became something rarer, a survivor who knew that sometimes the quietest path was the only one that led to dawn. After the annulment, Anne entered a strangely ironic chapter of her life. Rejected before all of Europe, yet granted something almost no queen of her age ever tasted a measure of genuine freedom. No longer was she required to share a bed with a body collapsing under infection, nor was she expected to bear the crushing burden of producing a male heir for a king whose temper ruled his kingdom more fiercely than any law. She no longer lived beneath the sword edge of royal displeasure, where a wrong word, a wrong expression, or even a wrong silence might lead her down the path once taken by queens before her. Instead, she possessed lands of her own, income that arrived faithfully, houses in which she could breathe without fear, and a title that wrapped her in dignity while keeping her safely distant from the throne that had nearly destroyed her. On her estates, a new Anne quietly blossomed, not the discarded bride, not the foreign queen mocked by courtiers, but a capable landholder with a mind sharpened by observation and necessity. She negotiated leases with a firmness that surprised those who expected timidity. She examined farming practices, introduced methods from the continent, improved soil and yield, and provided stable work for villagers who soon began to see her not as a political embarrassment, but as a fair and generous steward. Her presence softened the hardships of the surrounding communities, and in return, their loyalty formed a protective ring around her name. In a world governed by noble whims and royal storms, the affection of common people was a rare armor. Her financial independence, too, grew steadily. With her understanding of diplomacy and her connections among German and English merchants, she forged trading partnerships that quietly enriched her life. Small profits accumulated into substantial wealth, and because these dealings operated far beneath the interests of the crown, they were hers to manage freely. With this prosperity, she extended her influence through acts of charity, funding schools for children, improving small hospitals for the sick, offering gifts to religious houses, and supporting local priests and scholars. Each gesture wove another layer of goodwill around her, shielding her in ways no royal decree ever could. At court, she held the polite but powerless title of the king's sister. It granted her a position of visibility without responsibility, honor without danger. She was invited to ceremonies, offered a seat of respect, included in pageantry, yet she was never expected to rule, never drawn into the battles of ambition, never placed where Henry's shifting moods could strike her again. Her role existed in a delicate middle ground, noticeable but not threatening, present but not essential. And in this strange liminality, she found peace. In a palace where everyone clawed for proximity to power, where families schemed through marriages and alliances, where a misplaced ambition could mean ruin, Anne alone stepped backward. She declined the poisonous gift of influence. She refused to re-enter the game that had once nearly cost her life. In doing so, she became nearly untouchable. Her withdrawal, gentle and deliberate, removed her from the corridors, where whispers circulated like venom. She was neither rival nor ally in political feuds, neither obstacle nor pawn. She existed just far enough away from the throne that no faction saw her as a threat, and just close enough to be treated with respect. It was this balance, this conscious quietness that preserved her. While others rose and fell in rapid succession, Devoured by intrigue or undone by the king's moods, Anne remained steady. She had learned, with painful clarity, that survival in Tudor England required not boldness, but subtlety, not confrontation, but calm, not a fight for visibility, but a willingness to let oneself fade into the soft edges of the court's perception. And so she lived, not as the disgraced queen foreigners imagined, but as a woman who had slipped through the iron jaws of Tudor politics with her life intact. She cultivated her lands, strengthened her friendships, supported her communities, and walked through the palace as someone who had mastered the rarest art of all, to be present without being prey. In stepping back, she saved herself. In relinquishing the crown, she preserved the years ahead, and in choosing obscurity over glory, she ensured that her story, though whispered, would endure long after more powerful voices had been silenced. As the years drifted forward, Anne wove herself more naturally into the fabric of English life. She learned the English language with such diligence that she soon handled legal papers, financial accounts, and household correspondence without the help of an interpreter. Her expense books quietly revealed her commitment. Steady payments to language tutors, music masters, and instructors in ceremonial etiquette. These were not the gestures of a woman merely tolerating her circumstances, but of someone reshaping her place in the world with patience and intention. Gradually, she formed genuine friendships among several noble families, relationships rooted not in her brief queenship, but in her composure, intelligence, and gentle discretion. These bonds, free from the frantic ambition common in court life, circled her like a soft ring of protection. Through them she heard the murmurs of political winds, the movements of factions, and the temper of the kingdom. Yet she remained untouched by the pull of alliances or rivalries. Her friends admired her steadiness. They did not seek to use her. In a court where motives often hid behind smiles, this was a rare and precious refuge. Her usefulness extended beyond social grace. English nobles who needed to correspond with continental counterparts, especially those in Lutheran regions, turned to Anne as their bridge. She possessed what few others did: information, language, and diplomatic authority, quiet and enduring. With each letter she translated, each message she delivered, she strengthened her position as a silent conduit between England and Europe. She occupied no official office, yet her influence threaded itself through corridors of faith and politics with soft, nearly invisible persistence. During the reign of Edward VI, her relevance deepened. The reformist factions trusted her instincts. She was German-born, Protestant by background, and well-connected with theologians and scholars across the continent. Visitors from Wittenberg, Strasbourg, and Zurich recognized her not as a discarded queen, but as a familiar figure within their intellectual world. She offered advice carefully, connected individuals who might benefit from one another, and facilitated the exchange of letters carrying the ideas that were reshaping England's religious identity. She neither preached nor commanded, yet her presence subtly guided the current. She became an advisor without title, a counselor without formal power, a vessel through which reform flowed quietly. When Henry died, and the succession crisis fractured the kingdom, the court dissolved into frantic competition. Nobles aligned themselves with factions they believed would rise. Some wagered correctly, others disastrously. Many were dragged into ruin by their chosen loyalties. But Anne watched from a deliberate distance. She maintained warm, measured relationships with all sides, including Mary Tudor, whose Catholic convictions stood so far from Anne's own Protestant upbringing. Yet Mary respected Anne's intelligence and restraint, recognizing in her neither enemy nor threat, but a woman who understood the delicate art of survival in a world where faith and power collided. This neutrality became Anne's sanctuary. While the storms of ambition gathered over England, she stood at the quiet center, unclaimed by any faction, unscarred by political upheaval. Her temperament, neither fiery nor timid, shielded her more effectively than any army. She saw clearly what others could not. Choosing a side was often the first step toward destruction. So she chose instead to be steady, a gentle, unwavering figure, whose presence offended no one and comforted many. Through these choices, Anne remained beyond the reach of bloodshed, as purges swept through the court. Others fell to accusations, suspicions, and shifting allegiances, but she walked untouched. Her life became a lesson whispered through the palace halls, that power is not always found in crowns or commands, but in the quiet, careful shaping of one's relationships, that sometimes the surest safety lies not in influence, but in restraint. Anne had survived marriage to a volatile king, Now she survived the chaos that followed him, not by force, but by wisdom, by equilibrium, by standing close enough to be respected, yet far enough to be forgotten when danger crept near. In a court obsessed with taking sides, Anne lived on by choosing none. From the safety of her quiet retreat, Anne watched as the court continued to consume fresh victims. Catherine Howard, the young girl, once paraded as the weapon meant to eclipse Anne, was swiftly overwhelmed by suspicion, interrogation, and finally the scaffold. In less than 2 years after her marriage, Catherine was executed for alleged adultery. Her youth, her charm, and the sweetness that had once entranced Henry could not protect her from the fury of a king who had grown increasingly paranoid, ill, and unstable. To Anne, the girl's tragic fate was a chilling confirmation that her own choice to bow and survive had not been cowardice, but strategy. Had she resisted like Catherine of Aragon, or fought boldly like Anne Boleyn, her name might easily have become the third carved among the king's beheaded wives. The axe, she understood, had never been far. Meanwhile, Henry descended deeper into ruin. His body continued to swell, crack, and bleed. His ulcers worsened. His limbs ached beneath the crushing weight of infection. His breath, thick with the scent of rot, grew so unbearable that ceremonial rules were quietly crafted to ensure anyone approaching him kept a careful distance. And as his flesh deteriorated, so too did his mind. He was haunted by visions of betrayal, convinced of conspiracies in every whisper, terrified of treason hiding behind every lowered gaze. His own failing body became his tormentor, a constant reminder that no crown, no decree, no empire could shield him from decay. In stark contrast, Anne moved through her days with gentle steadiness. She accumulated wealth not through cunning schemes, but through patient management of her estates. She nurtured friendships, built trust, and cultivated a life grounded in order rather than ambition. Her lands flourished under her direction. Her household ran with quiet discipline. Her name slowly shed the weight of shame imposed upon it. Even those who had once mocked her, repeating the king's insults, mimicking her accent, calling her plain, now found themselves forced into a quieter truth. Anne was not foolish, not weak, not unworthy. She was, in fact, one of the rare women who navigated Henry's world and emerged not ruined, but intact. And more than intact, she lived well. Where Henry grew monstrous in his suffering, Anne grew measured in her peace. Where he raged, she reasoned. Where he decayed, she thrived. Her resilience became a silent indictment of his cruelty. Her grace, a mirror reflecting the grotesque transformation of the once mighty king. The contrast between them, the sovereign, whose power could not save him from himself, and the discarded queen who found serenity after disgrace, formed the quiet moral cord running beneath the entire story. It exposed the truth that Tudor greatness was often hollow, propped up by fear and violence, while the strength that endured belonged not to thrones, but to those who carried their burdens with calm. Anne, once mocked as a political mistake, now embodied something far more enduring: the wisdom of stepping back, the courage of survival, and the soft but unbreakable dignity of a woman who refused to be destroyed by the man who had tried to discard her. When Henry died in the cold month of January in the year 1547, chaos rippled instantly through the court. Many who had fastened their fortunes to his final wishes found themselves trembling, unsure which faction would rise, which would fall, and whose name might be erased by the shifting tides of power. But Anne was different. She had long prepared for this moment, quietly anchoring herself not to the crown, but to stability, to her properties, to her network of continental connections, and to the careful political neutrality she had practiced for years. While others scrambled, she simply stepped into the next chapter with a calm that seemed almost otherworldly in a realm built upon fear. The Protestant government under Edward VI valued her deeply. Her understanding of theology, her relationships with German reformers, and her discretion made her a quiet but trusted presence. She did not seek to guide policy, but when asked, she offered perspective, shaped by experience rather than ambition. Even Mary Tudor, later Mary I, devoutly Catholic and stern in her convictions, maintained respect for Anne. They disagreed in faith. Yet Mary recognized the rare intelligence and gentle diplomacy that defined Anne's character. It was a testament to Anne's equilibrium that she could move gracefully between rulers of opposing beliefs without ever appearing treacherous or threatening. As Henry's memory hardened into a symbol of rot, a body that had decayed before his kingdom, a reign corroded by suspicion and violence, Anne emerged as his opposite. Where he had grown monstrous, she remained measured. Where he had ruled through fear, she lived through balance. At Richmond, she hosted small gatherings that resembled intimate salons, where scholars and nobles could speak freely, unburdened by the terror that once stalked the court. These meetings did not shape governments or topple kingdoms, but they created something quietly radical, a space where thought could breathe without fear. By the time she entered her 50s, Anne had achieved what very few women of the 16th century ever could, a life that was genuinely her own. She possessed private wealth, she held influence not granted by a husband, a father, or a son, but cultivated through her own choices. She answered to no man's authority. The freedom she nurtured, fragile yet profound, stood in stark contrast to the fates of the women who had shared Henry's marriage bed. Most had died pleading for justice. Anne lived, not loudly, but steadily, in the quiet liberty she carved from the wreckage of her past. When her final day came, she left the world not in disgrace, but in dignity. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, honoured with ceremony, surrounded by nobles, ambassadors, and scholars who had come to admire the unassuming strength of her life. It was a peaceful end, almost unbelievable when set against the humiliation that marked her arrival at Hampton Court so many years before. And yet, for centuries, historians, most of them men, repeated the slander forged by Tudor propaganda, that Anne had been plain, foolish, lucky to escape death. They echoed Henry's lies as though they were truth, unaware of how deeply they had been shaped by the king's need to justify his own failures. Only with modern scholarship did those layers of deception begin to peel away. Beneath them emerged the real Anne, intelligent, deliberate, patient, and far stronger than the caricature history had painted. Her story reminds us that victory does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it is not the triumph of force, but the quiet act of retaining dignity when the world tries to strip it away. Sometimes survival itself is the rebellion to live longer than the tyrant who sought to crush you, to endure until history grows brave enough to tell the truth. Anne of Cleves won not by conquering a king, but by outlasting him, and by allowing time, slow, steady, and fair, to restore her name. As England entered the post-Henry age, the image of the late king grew increasingly distorted in the eyes of those who had witnessed his final years. Foreign ambassadors wrote in their dispatches that Henry, near the end, resembled a mass of decaying flesh, tormented by pain, volatile in temperament, and utterly unable to command the very body that had once symbolized his power. The legends that had glorified his youth, the handsome knight, the dazzling dancer, the sharp and vigorous mind, now felt like distant echoes of a life that no longer existed. His decline was so complete, so grotesque, that the Tudor propaganda machine strained desperately to maintain a heroic facade. To protect the myth, the court found it necessary to create scapegoats, people whose reputations could be damaged to distract from the truth of the king's ruin. Among those pulled into this vortex of fabrication, Anne of Cleves had once been a convenient target. And yet, as the years passed, the contrast between Henry and Anne grew impossible to ignore. While he had sunk into agony and physical collapse, she had risen into an unexpected kind of triumph, quiet, steady, and without the slightest need for spectacle. Those who once mocked her began to re-evaluate their judgments. They saw not a cast-off bride, nor a foreign misfit, but a woman who had mastered the rare art of withdrawing at the perfect moment. She had taken the freedom Henry grudgingly gave her and transformed it into a foundation for a new life, independent, educated, and deeply rooted in her own dignity. The more turbulent England became, the more admirable Anne appeared. In a political climate where proximity to the throne meant constant danger, she had selected the one strategy few understood. She stepped aside, not in defeat, but in clarity. Others pursued influence, titles, or favour, and paid with their lives. Anne chose stability over power, restraint over ambition, and silence over the deadly noise of court intrigue. Her survival became its own quiet argument against the brutality she had endured. To those who watched the court unravel in the aftermath of Henry's death, Anne's existence carried a peculiar lesson. Her calm had been mistaken for weakness, her modesty for simplicity, but in truth, she possessed a form of strength that Tudor England rarely rewarded and even more rarely recognized. She endured not by dominating others, but by refusing to be drawn into the battles that had destroyed countless men and women. Her life, lived just beyond the reach of royal chaos, revealed that there are victories untouched by swords, triumphs unspoken in public squares. Her story showed that tranquility itself can be a form of resistance, a refusal to allow cruelty to shape the soul. And in time, the whispers that once mocked her transformed into a deeper respect. She was no longer the woman Henry found displeasing. She became, instead, the figure who outlasted him not only in years, but in judgment. Long after the tyrant's power crumbled beneath its own rot, Anne's quiet voice, shaped by patience and understanding, continued to echo. In the long arc of history, those who shout often fade quickly, but those who survive, who remain gentle, steadfast, and unbroken, linger in memory long after crowns have turned to dust. Anne of Cleves proved that the softest defiance can be the most enduring, and that sometimes the most powerful story is told not by the conqueror, but by the one who simply lives on. As scholars have dug deeper into the record, they have come to see that the life of Anne of Cleves is far more than a personal tragedy. It is a map, an illuminated diagram revealing the machinery of cruelty that powered the Tudor court. Henry's need for a scapegoat, his terror of his own decline, his obsession with preserving an image of strength he no longer possessed. All of these became the starting point of a system that fed on fear, obedience, and carefully orchestrated deception. Around him, courtiers sharpened lies like weapons, crafting slanders not because they believed them, but because their survival depended on flattering a monarch who mistook his own vulnerability for betrayal. Anne, unwittingly, became the perfect lens through which to see this structure. She did not rebel, did not scheme, did not commit any offense, and yet she was still crushed beneath the weight of a narrative designed to protect a king who could not bear the truth of his own body. The fabrications were relentless. Physicians invented medical explanations for Henry's impotence, insisting that something in Anne's German nature had disturbed his masculine vigor. Gossipers painted her wedding night as a grotesque failure, as though her very existence had somehow repelled him. The humiliating examinations, the whispered insults, the cruel nickname Flanders Mare, all were recorded, preserved, and repeated, revealing that the Tudor court did not require reality. It required stories that served power. Anne's dignity was not destroyed because she lacked beauty or wit. It was destroyed because the king needed a narrative in which he remained unblemished. Through Anne's treatment, later generations could finally see the broader truth. Women in that era were not only bound by political marriages, but also by state-sponsored storytelling. Their worth could be rewritten overnight, their honor erased by a single decree. In that world, reputation was as fragile as parchment, and a woman's survival depended not on who she was, but on what version of her the crown chose to circulate. Yet Anne stands as an extraordinary exception, proof that quiet intelligence can survive even the harshest distortions. Her silence was not emptiness. It was a form of strategy. Her flexibility, her ability to adapt without surrendering her inner self, and her deep understanding of human nature transformed her from a victim into a survivor. She sensed instinctively what others failed to grasp. The more one resisted Henry, the more violently the machine of power responded. In stepping aside, she stepped out of the path of destruction. As the fog of history lifts, the figure who emerges is not the dull, naive woman Tudor propaganda described. It is Henry, not Anne, who appears consumed by fear, illness, and decaying pride. The myth he built to protect himself now exposes his fragility, while Anne's endurance exposes her strength. Her story does more than illustrate the brutality of the Tudor world. It illuminates the resilience of a woman who walked through a political storm and never lost the quiet core of who she was. Anne of Cleves teaches us that survival, too, is a kind of power, that the softest resistance can outlast the sharpest cruelty, and that sometimes the truest victory belongs not to the one who shouts the loudest, but to the one who remains standing when the storm has passed, whole and unbroken. For centuries, traditional history repeated the lies Henry had scattered like seeds, that Anne was unattractive, awkward, lacking charm, and that the failure of their marriage rested solely on her shoulders. These claims were passed from chronicle to chronicle, textbook to textbook, until they hardened into accepted truth. But when modern scholars began to examine medical reports, diplomatic letters, and the detailed notes of foreign ambassadors, a very different picture emerged. The Anne of the archives was calm, dignified, well-educated, and not remotely the ugly caricature that Tudor propaganda so eagerly promoted. What is most revealing is this. The harshest judgments of Anne almost always came from within Henry's own circle, from courtiers desperate to shield their king from embarrassment, those who had actually met her, Germans, Dutch envoys, even French ambassadors who had no reason to flatter her, consistently described her as pleasant, intelligent, and properly refined. Their accounts make it clear that Anne's supposed shortcomings were political inventions, not reflections of her true character. Placed within her political context, Anne appears far less passive than earlier generations believed. She maneuvered with quiet precision, balancing international relationships, avoiding factional warfare, and building enough personal wealth to ensure her safety. The more closely researchers study her financial records, the more remarkable she becomes. Anne was one of the first early modern women in England to possess a fully independent financial system, lands, revenue, and assets legally under her own control, not supervised by a father, husband, or son. In an age when a woman's identity and property were usually swallowed by the men around her, this made her an anomaly, almost a forerunner of economic independence. As historians have peeled back the layers of Tudor myth-making, Anne's reputation has undergone a profound restoration. She is no longer merely the disliked wife or the queen dismissed for political convenience. She is seen instead as a resilient strategist who navigated one of the most dangerous courts in European history without losing her integrity. She read people shrewdly, adapted quickly, and understood when to yield, when to wait, and when to step aside entirely. These were not signs of weakness, but of mastery. That is why modern historians increasingly refer to her as the survivor queen. She survived not through force or influence, but through intelligence, emotional clarity, and the rare ability to understand human nature at its most volatile. While others perished under Henry's shifting storms, Anne found the one path that led not only to safety, but to a life of calm prosperity. In reclaiming her story, scholars have revealed what the Tudor court worked so hard to bury. Anne of Cleves was never the problem. She was the proof that wisdom can outlast power, and that dignity, even when whispered, can echo longer than the loudest decree of a king. The story of Anne stretches far beyond the private sorrow of a discarded queen. It becomes a lesson on the nature of authoritarian power itself. The voice of the strong can drown out truth, and the lies crafted to protect authority can outlive generations. For a time, Henry's version of events that Anne was unworthy, unattractive, deficient, was accepted simply because it came from the throne. But time, patient and unhurried, eventually washes away the fictions of kings. Henry, who once thundered his will across Europe through war, doctrine, blood, and fire, ended his life as a symbol of decay. A monarch who could not walk, could not sleep, could not heal. A man who blamed everyone but himself for the ruin of his body and the shadows of his conscience. His power, once absolute, collapsed inward until nothing remained but a fading echo of grandeur. Anne, whom he humiliated, outlived that power. She did not seek revenge, nor try to overturn the narrative, nor strike back with grand gestures. Her victory unfolded quietly. She held on to her dignity when others tried to take it from her. She built a life not of triumphal spectacle, but of steadiness, safety, and meaning. She endured, and in enduring, she won. Her story whispers that some victories are not forged on battlefields, but in the heart, in the decision to remain oneself despite cruelty, to refuse to let another's brutality distort one's spirit. It reminds us that not all strength is loud. Sometimes the truest strength is soft. The ability to bend without breaking, to survive without hardening, to persist without surrendering what makes one human. In a world enthralled by swords and thrones, Anne offers another model, the strength of gentle persistence. She shows that stepping aside is not always defeat. Sometimes it is the only strategy that ensures life, peace, and the space to become something more than a casualty of power. Her retreat was not surrender, it was clarity. It allowed her to outlast the king who tried to diminish her. Thus Anne becomes Henry's moral counterweight. Against his shouting stands her quiet endurance. Against his tyranny stands her patience. Against his decay stands her steadiness. One voice roared and ruled through fear, the other breathed softly, and yet it is that softness, calm, resilient, unmistakable, that history continues to hear long after the roar has died. Hey guys! As we come to the end of Anne's long and winding journey, let's slow everything down, just a little. Let the noise of courts and kings drift further away, like footsteps fading down a silent corridor. and let what remains be only the soft outline of a woman who learned, in her own quiet way, how to survive a world built to break her. Anne's story, when we set aside the politics and the drama, becomes something gentler, something almost luminous. She reminds us that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it breathes. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it chooses stillness over struggle, and finds, in that stillness, a path the world never expected. As you rest here with me, picture her not in the cold halls of Hampton Court, not beneath the weight of ridicule, but in the peaceful years that came after, wandering through her gardens at Richmond, hands lightly brushing the herbs and late summer blooms, sunlight resting on her shoulders, a woman no longer defined by a crown, but by the quiet steadiness of a life she rebuilt, a life that was hers. And maybe that is the quiet truth her story offers us tonight. That dignity can survive cruelty, that gentleness can outlast power, and that sometimes the most meaningful victories happen far away from applause, in the quiet rooms of our own hearts, where we decide who we are despite what the world demands of us. So if you've felt small, or overlooked, or pushed aside by forces larger than yourself, let Anne's journey wrap around you like a soft blanket. Let it remind you that stepping back is not the same as giving up, and that the path forward doesn't always require a fight. Sometimes it simply asks you to keep breathing, keep being, keep choosing yourself. In the dimming light of her story, let the sharpness fade, let the shadows soften, and let the last image of Anne be one of calm, a woman who endured storms but was never claimed by them. And now, as we slowly close the doors of this chapter, I wish you a night filled with ease, with gentleness, with the comforting sense that your own story, too, is allowed to unfold quietly and beautifully in its own time. Sleep well, my friends, and if you enjoyed drifting through history with us tonight, don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss the next soft, strange, beautiful story waiting in the dark. Good night, and may peace follow you into your dreams. Inside the tower, Anne faced her first night as a prisoner. The physical comfort of her chambers could not soften the terror that crept over her. Her thoughts spiraled through fear, disbelief, and a fragile hope that still fluttered, faint but persistent. Her mood was visibly deteriorating. She paced, wept, and tried to steady herself, though her mind felt pulled in too many directions at once. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, came to speak with her. He was responsible for her confinement, but he was not a cruel man. He observed her with the calm professionalism expected of someone who had overseen the imprisonment of nobles before. Anne clung to him as a source of information, perhaps hoping for clarity or even comfort. She repeated what she had insisted earlier to the Privy Council, that she was the king's lawful wife. Her voice was strained but determined, as though repeating this truth might somehow protect her. Then she asked Kingston the question that had been echoing inside her since her arrest. Did he know why she had been brought here? Kingston replied that he did not. Whether that was honesty or a necessary lie, no one could say. Perhaps he truly did not know the depth of Cromwell's accusations, or perhaps he understood that any truth he offered would only worsen her despair. Anne's desperation grew. She asked after those who had always stood by her, particularly her father, Thomas Boleyn. She wanted reassurance that he was fighting for her, that he was petitioning the king, that he was refusing to abandon his daughter. But the reality, cold and unyielding, was that Thomas Boleyn had already withdrawn into silence. Fear for his own life and status outweighed paternal duty. He could not or would not oppose Cromwell's rising tide. In choosing self-preservation, he left Anne more alone than she had ever been. Meanwhile, at Whitehall, Henry retired to his chambers alone. His wife, the woman he had once defied nations for, was imprisoned, and the palace that had once echoed with their ambition now held only his solitary footsteps. Throughout the day, he had maintained a veneer of calm, even cheerfulness, distracting himself with feasts, conversations, and the company of other women. But when Cromwell's detailed report of accusations reached him that night, something shifted. According to accounts from those near him, Henry wept as he read the charges. Tears slid down the face of the king, who had once celebrated Anne's triumphs and now presided over her ruin. But were those tears genuine? Did they reflect sorrow for Anne or sorrow for himself? This question has lingered for centuries. Some have imagined Henry grieving the collapse of a love he had once believed in. Others, including Tracy, suggest something more complicated, that Henry's tears were not for Anne at all, but for the man he believed himself to be. A man who had chosen Anne, elevated her, reshaped England, for her only to feel betrayed by her alleged infidelity. In this interpretation, the tears were not a sign of empathy, but of wounded pride. The king who had gambled everything on Anne now felt humiliated by the idea that she might have deceived him. Thus his sorrow, if it can be called sorrow, was a twisted, self-focused grief. The grief of a man who saw himself as the injured party. Back in the Tower, Anne knew nothing of Henry's tears, real or imagined. She knew only the silence of the stone walls and the growing sense that her world had tilted irrevocably. As night settled over London, she lay awake in the chambers, once meant to honour her, listening to the faint footsteps in the corridor and wondering whether dawn would bring mercy or destruction. The machinery of her downfall was already in motion, and Cromwell, ever patient, was tightening every bolt. Night settled over the Tower of London with a heaviness that seemed almost alive, as though the ancient stones themselves exhaled the weight of centuries. Shadows stretched long across the courtyards, and the murmurs of guards faded into the kind of silence that presses against the ribs. It was in this atmosphere, thick with dread, with memory, with the whispered legends of ghosts, that Anne found herself utterly alone in the Queen's lodgings. Though her chambers were still furnished with the luxury befitting a queen, the air inside them felt cold, hollow, stripped of comfort. Silk curtains whispered faintly with each draught, and the gilded carvings on the walls seemed to shrink away from her. Here, surrounded by reminders of her brief glory, she confronted the unbearable uncertainty of what awaited her. Sleep would not come. Hope flickered weakly, but fear of the unknown, of betrayal, of death pressed more tightly around her than any velvet mantle. It was during this long, suffocating night that one of the most famous letters in Tudor history was said to have been written. A letter attributed to Anne, addressed to Henry, composed from within the Tower. Whether every word is truly hers remains debated, but the emotions carried in its lines feel strikingly real, a mixture of pride, desperation, and lingering belief in justice. In the letter, Anne pleaded, "Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges, for my truth shall fear no open shame." These words, delicate yet fierce, were the voice of a woman who refused to bow completely to despair. She was frightened, yes, she was overwhelmed, but she still held to the idea that truth, her truth, might prevail. Even as Cromwell's machinery tightened around her, even as accusations multiplied, she believed a fair trial could save her. The letter revealed her faith not in Henry's love, which had already vanished, but in the rule of law she hoped he would honour. It was the final echo of the woman Henry had once adored, intelligent, articulate, unwavering in her sense of dignity. Yet Anne could not know that the trial she begged for had already been shaped, moulded, manipulated, long before she entered the courtroom. Her enemies, sworn, powerful, and numerous, were already in place. The charges were ready. The outcome was all but inscribed in stone. The Tower walls, if they could speak, might have told her the truth. That no lawful trial awaited her, only a performance crafted for politics, for spectacle, for the satisfaction of a king who wished to rewrite his past. But in this moment, this fragile, trembling moment, she still believed. She paced the room, her steps muffled by thick rugs. Sometimes she sat motionless, staring into the darkened corners where the flickering candlelight couldn't reach. Sometimes she whispered prayers under her breath. Outside, a distant bell tolled the hours. Inside, she held tightly to the idea that justice, however faint, might still be within reach. The episode of her story ends with a question suspended in the air. Would Anne receive the fair trial she begged for? History, of course, provides the answer. She was executed on the 19th of May. Her trial, swift, biased, and devastating, sealed her fate long before she walked into the courtroom. But the structure of the narrative lingers on that moment in her chamber, on the plea written into the shadows of the Tower, allowing us to feel the ache of what she felt. Because in that room, while the city slept and the river whispered below the walls, Anne Boleyn still hoped. She still believed that truth could triumph, that justice could withstand politics, that her husband might yet remember the woman he once loved. It is that hope, fragile, misguided, heartbreakingly human, that remains suspended in the dark, long after the candle in her chamber burned out. And as the final notes fade, the viewer is left with a tightness in the throat, knowing what Anne could not. That hope, for her, was already slipping away. As the story slowly comes to a close, let the images that have passed begin to soften. like the final ripples on the surface of the Thames as evening settles in. Imagine the warm, golden light gently spreading across the ancient walls of the Tower of London, where Anne Boleyn once endured the longest night of her life. And then, just as the night embraces the city, we allow the story to drift quietly into the distance, as gently as a breath. Anne stepped into history not only because of her tragedy, but because of the message her life leaves behind. That power, no matter how high, is as fragile as glass, that even the strongest hearts can be swept away by the winds of ambition and circumstance, and that human beings, whether kings or queens, carry within them fear, hope, and a longing to be understood. Anne was not only a fallen queen, she is a reminder that behind the darkness of grand palaces there are still small, beating souls trying to hold on to what they believe is right. Now, let your shoulders relax, and allow the quiet that flows from this story to settle around you. The sounds of that distant court fade one by one, the water brushing against the side of a boat, footsteps on damp stone, even the whisper of letters that never reached their intended hands, all drifting away, leaving behind a space that feels soft, peaceful, and still. Let your mind rest in the knowledge that although the story was filled with storms, it also carries a gentle truth, that pride, honesty, and faith in justice, even when crushed, remain small lanterns that keep the darkness from swallowing everything. And sometimes, simply keeping those lanterns alive inside ourselves is enough to help us walk through the long days of our own lives. So now, allow your eyes to close as lightly as petals. Let your breathing slow, round, and warm. And let the story of a queen who lived, who loved, who fought, and who hoped, lull you gently towards sleep. I wish you a very good night, deep and restful. And if you would like to continue this journey with us, these soft stories, these quiet pieces of history whispered into the dark, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss any of our newest and best videos. Wishing you a peaceful night. Until we meet again in the next dream.